Greetings, my friends. Father Leo here. And again, I put forth and post my reflection for the 19th Sunday in Ordinary Time, August 13, 2023. And it's really appropriate for this one because when I reflected on the gospel, it's about fear and trust. Those are two words that really go to the heart of the story of the gospel. And as I read authors today, and even our own in the press that we have here in Ontario, so many writers are writing about the fear and anxiety of people in today's world. We've just come out of a COVID, and that has been a really difficult time for many people. This summer we've been dealing with fires, a lot of fires, more fires than before. Good woods are being burnt up. People are having to flee their homes. There's been stories of drought and what it costs the earth. Different kinds of storms, even here and near in other towns. Severe storms and water. Not so much there was so much water, but the fact it came down in such a short time, and it resulted in a lot of flooding. So, and they've talked about moved from climate warming to climate boiling. The heat, apparently in some places, the hottest summer on record. And scientists particularly, are writing about the harm being done to our planet, and is that planet and harm being done to it eventually going to mean that the human race will no longer be able to live on planet Earth? Does it mean that planet Earth will no longer be a hospitable home for humans? Because it seems that basically it's primarily humans who brought on climate warming, and somehow the storms and fires and droughts are all language of the earth telling us something. And yet, to a great extent, life goes on. Life goes on. Pollution goes on. Consumerism goes on. Violence and war goes on. People in responsible positions go on because they continue to make lots of money. So there is a lot of fear and anxiety across our land today. And I think today's gospel, it doesn't solve that problem. But what it does do, perhaps help us to deal with our fears so we can be more creative in dealing with the issues at hand. I don't like to call them problems. I prefer to call them issues. The issues we have. And remember, our issue is not with the world, the earth. Our issue is with people who are using and abusing the earth. And the earth is protesting by, like I said, thunder and lightning and drought, fires. She's saying, come on, people, wake up. You can't go on like this forever. So I turn to the gospel. Here's Jesus, and it's a powerful story about fear and trust. Apparently, the disciples and Jesus, the disciples went out in a boat to cross the lake. And while they were crossing a lake, a big storm came up. So much so that they were afraid of drowning. And that's a real fear. If any of you have ever been out in a boat, maybe you're a fisher person, or you've been out in a boat and the large waves came up, we know the danger of a boat capsizing and people drowning. So when they talk about them, the crowd that they went on a boat, got into a boat to cross the waves, it says the boat was battered by the waves. So clearly, the waves were very large. But behind the waves, there was the wind. There was a strong wind which was causing the waves. So, and the friends of Jesus were in the boat, and as far as they could see, the danger of the boat capsizing. And they would be dropped into the water and the possibility of drowning. So you have that possibility of things coming to an abrupt end because of the storm. But then all of a sudden, they notice Jesus comes to them walking on the water. So it's a story. It's a story. Walking on the water. Jesus walked on water. And this story is fashioned in such a way not to prove that Jesus is a magician and can walk on water. The story has the purpose of teaching about trust, fear and trust, fear and trust. And so it tells us that when the disciples looked up and saw Jesus coming to them, walking on the water, they thought it was a ghost. And they cried out in fear. So, even as they were close to Jesus, very familiar with his way of dealing with issues, very trusting of Jesus, yet when they see him walking on water, a most unusual thing, I think, then and now. Not too many people can walk on water. Jesus did. That's the story. Is it factual? Well, pays your money, take your choice. But their reaction of the disciples is not very positive. They say it's a ghost. So now first we have the waves. Now we have a ghost coming after us. No wonder they cried out in fear. So right away, fear is already there. And when they see Jesus, thinking he's a ghost, the fear increases. The fear increases. And Jesus doesn't begin by speaking to the storm. He speaks to the disciples. He said, "Take heart, it's I. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid." And I remember reading many years ago where a scripture scholar counted up the number of times in the Gospels Jesus said, "Be not afraid." He used that expression very often because he recognized that humans have a tendency to be fearful, to experience fear if there's fire, if there are storms, if there's violence, darkness particularly. A lot of things can trigger fear in people. And Jesus knew that. Jesus knew that. And he said, "Take heart, be not afraid." So right away, Jesus goes to the heart of the matter. Heart of the matter. When he says, "Be not afraid," it's because Jesus is going to call his disciples to trust. To trust. And so we know that Jesus walked towards the boat, and Peter, who so often seems to put his foot in his mouth, and he's the one who says, "Don't you know, are you going to let us drown, Jesus? Don't you know it's a strong wind blowing, large waves?" No wonder. I'm scared. Peter is really saying, I think I'm a big, tough fisherman, but when push comes to shove, fear has been triggered in me. I'm afraid. I am afraid. But what he does do, he turns to Jesus. "Lord, save me." So underneath all that fear, there is his trust and confidence that somehow Jesus will save him. So right away he notices that the ghost is not a ghost. It's Jesus who appears. And Jesus says to him, little faith, why do you doubt? Why do you doubt? I wonder if we ever heard those words. Have we ever spoken them? Or have we ever felt them? That's a good question. I know I have many times. And and so Jesus says to Peter, to show you that if you put your trust in me, you too can walk on water. And Peter says, well, okay, let's give it a try. Let's give it a try. And Peter gets out of the boat and he walks on water. He has put his trust in Jesus. But suddenly Peter realizes, oh my God, I'm walking on water. Humans can't walk on water. He loses his trust immediately and he starts to sink. And again he calls out to Jesus, Lord, save me. And of course, the response of Jesus is, trust me, trust me. So it's a very powerful story today. And I think in the day and age in which we're living right now, with all that's going on, we do well to reflect and meditate on that particular story. We're living in fear-filled times. There's a lot of darkness in our world. And there are many good reasons to be fearful. It's not abnormal to be fearful when there is a threat. And there are many threats, not just the environment, not just the weather, not just the fires, the droughts. Some places there's the threat of starvation because of lack of food. In some countries there's the threat of the violence, even from their own governments, where people are being killed. So there are, and a lot of threats closer to home as well. So I think what I'm trying to say this morning, threats are real. Some threats are real, some threats are imagined. They are our irrational thoughts, or our ITs as we call them, where we see threat where there is no threat and produces fear because of our ITs. So they're the issue. It's our irrational thoughts, our ITs, and we need to deal with them. Because if we don't deal with them, we'll project it out and we'll find a scapegoat, somebody to blame. The blame, shame, guilt thing will go into action, and that doesn't help anybody. It just means the waves are getting deeper, stronger, and there's more danger. But it's a self-destruct kind of things that comes from those irrational thoughts that we have within us. And part of dealing with irrational thoughts is, first of all, we have to be humble enough to admit that we do have irrational thoughts. I'll bet you can't meet anybody anywhere that hasn't or doesn't have ITs, my guess. But the point is to identify and name our ITs. Because if we know who it is that's threatening us, then we can deal with it. If I know that the threat is coming from within myself, and it's my ITs, my thoughts, if you will, then I can take responsibility for them and have a way of venting, of healing those thoughts, so that I don't think fear-producing thoughts. So that's one of the tasks. The other task, of course, is when there is a real threat, and we think we have to walk on water, the storms of life, and God knows we have our own individual storms of life, whether it's illness or worries about finances, worries about our children or grandparents, worries about the economy, and the job loss or the possibility of losing a job. There are so many worries, if you will, which are symptomatic of the fears and the threats of living. But it's okay when we say it's given the situation. I'm not surprising I experience some fear. But in the face of fear, we often say fight, flight, or be frozen. Fight, well, becoming angry and aggressive and venting our anger or our fear, because behind anger is always fear. Venting my anger and fear on somebody and making them a scapegoat. Fight. Flight means to repress it. And by repressing it, it often means depression or anxiety. And the third is freeze, which means I am frozen. I don't do anything. I feel helpless. And that too can bring on depression and anxiety. But this gospel is saying we have a way out of that. And that is learning to trust. This story is about fear and trusting. Not just fear, but trusting. Find where we can trust. And it's not always myself or yourself. Sometimes it's trusting self. Sometimes it's trusting true friends where you can really talk and share with them, and you know you're going to find support, love and support. And you don't stand alone. We often hear somebody say, well, I got a friend. I know that he or she always has my back. That trusting in a friendship. Trusting. Trusting the wider community. Trusting one's own resilience and one's inner strength. And so, what Jesus is saying here is, yes, along with that, we can call out as Peter did, Lord, save me. And we ask God for the grace to be healed. Because a lot of us are because of our early experiences in life, instead of building a character of trust, we build a character of mistrust. And so a lot of our fears come out of the fact that we are a person who never really learned trust as a child. We lived on a very uncertain future, uncertain present, and we learned mistrust. And a lot of times, kids grow up where they can't trust. It's a very insecure situation, either in their home or at school or the neighborhood, or there's been trauma in their life. Mistrust is what they learn instead of trust. And so there's tremendous need for healing, the healing of the inner child, so the person can move from mistrust to trust. And then having that capacity to trust, we can put our trust in God, put our trust in ourselves, put our trust in our friends or community or whatever. But we need that healing of the inner child. And I like to think that's what happened with Peter. Then he said, Lord, save me. That's his inner child calling out. That Peter needed to have that healing of his inner child so that he could have trusted that he would not perish in the storm or would not perish when Jesus told him, come and walk on the water. You know? And so like Peter, we're going to meet the storms of life. That's a given. That's a given. Life has storms. But I think if we can learn to trust, that's the first thing. Because growing up, the first thing I always have to ask is, did I learn mistrust or trust? And if you learn trust, then you can respond very positively, like in the gospel, where Jesus said, trust me. You can say, yeah, that comes natural to me to trust. That's what I learned as a kid. But if I, as a child, learned mistrust or had experience of trauma and learned mistrust, it's not that simple. And so there is a need for inner healing of my childhood, where the Spirit and love of God heals that inner child, and the inner child then can move from mistrust to trust. And as an adult then, we have that basic foundation to be able to trust the situation, trust myself, trust other people, trust wherever you look, because we have it within us. That's who we are. We're trusting people. We are people who have the capacity to trust. And that's a great capacity. And I think that when so many people are writing about the anxiety of people at the present time, there's a lot of factors, but one of them, and only one, is that inability to trust. People learned mistrust as a child, became adults, and the mistrustful child is what lives within them. And that need for healing. And that too is something we can take to the Lord, that Jesus was a healer, and with his outpouring his great love, and the power of the Spirit, a person can be healed and move from being a person who mistrusts to a person who trusts. And if you are a trusting person, life's going to be a lot easier for you, especially when you are visited by the storms of life. God bless.